The arrogant Heiress. The twin suns shone brightly over the bustling alien marketplace. Strange creatures from every corner of the galaxy bartered for exotic goods, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony. Amidst the noise, Zoran moved through the crowd, his human frame standing out among the towering alien species. He was an engineer, known for fixing what others couldn't. But here, he was just another human. Small, insignificant, and looked down upon by almost everyone. "Watch where you're going, human." A sharp voice cut through the air. Zoran turned, his calm brown eyes meeting the fiery gaze of Alina, the Heiress of the Calithian Empire. She was tall, with shimmering blue skin and silver hair that cascaded like a waterfall over her shoulders. Her royal insignia glinted on her cloak, a symbol of her untouchable status. Behind her, a group of guards stood, their weapons gleaming and ready. "I didn't mean to bump into you," Zoran said, his tone steady. He knew better than to show fear or defiance. Humans were treated as second-class citizens in this part of the galaxy, and one wrong word could spell disaster. "Didn't mean to," Alina repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "Humans always mean to. You're clumsy, weak, and pathetic. I wonder why your kind is even allowed in places like this." The crowd stopped, eyes turning toward the scene. Whispers spread like wildfire. Some laughed, others watched in silence. Zoran could feel the heat rising in his face, but he kept his composure. "I apologize," he said simply, lowering his gaze. Arguing with her would only make things worse. But Alina wasn't done. "An apology. That's all. You humans think you can fix everything with words. Let me make something clear. You are beneath me. Don't ever come near me again." The words stung, but Zoran said nothing. He turned and walked away, the crowd parting as he passed. Behind him, he could still hear Alina's mocking laughter. As Zoran made his way toward his small workshop on the edge of the market, he replayed the encounter in his mind. It wasn't the first time he'd been insulted, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was something about Alina's words that stayed with him. She didn't just see humans as inferior. She saw them as worthless. "Maybe she'll learn one day," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. But before he could dwell on it further, a deafening explosion shattered the air. The ground trembled beneath Zoran's feet as a massive plume of smoke rose into the sky. Screams filled the marketplace as stalls collapsed and debris rained down. Zoran's instincts kicked in, and he rushed back toward the source of the explosion. When he reached the scene, chaos greeted him. Fires burned through the once busy market, and injured aliens lay scattered among the wreckage. And there, trapped beneath a fallen metal beam, was Alina. Her royal cloak was torn, and her face was smeared with dust and blood. Her once commanding voice was now filled with panic. "Help! Someone help me!" she screamed, but no one came. The crowd that had watched her insult Zoran only moments ago now avoided her, afraid of getting involved. Zoran hesitated. This was the same woman who had humiliated him in front of everyone. She wouldn't have done the same for him. But as he looked at her, struggling and desperate, he couldn't just walk away. "Hold on," he said, pushing his way through the debris. Alina's eyes widened when she saw him. "You? What are you doing here?" "Leave me. You'll only make it worse." Zoran ignored her protests and knelt beside her. The metal beam was heavy, but he could see it wasn't crushing her completely. It had pinned her leg. He grabbed a piece of broken pipe and used it as leverage, straining against the weight. "Stop. You'll never lift it," Alina said, her voice trembling. But there was a hint of something else. Fear. Zoran didn't answer. Sweat poured down his face as he pushed with all his strength. The beam shifted slightly, enough for Alina to free her leg. She scrambled out, wincing in pain. "Can you walk?" Zoran asked, offering her his hand. Alina stared at him, her pride battling with the reality of her situation. Finally, she took his hand, letting him help her to her feet. She winced again as she put weight on her leg. "I'll manage," she said, her voice quieter now. Before they could move, another explosion rocked the market, and a nearby structure began to collapse. Zoran grabbed Alina and pulled her out of the way just in time, shielding her with his body as debris crashed around them. When the dust settled, Alina looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For the first time, she seemed lost for words. "You're safe now," Zoran said, releasing her and stepping back. Alina opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, her guards arrived, weapons drawn. They pushed Zoran aside and surrounded her. "Are you hurt, my lady?" one of them asked. "I'm fine," Alina said, her voice regaining some of its usual sharpness. She glanced at Zoran, then looked away. "Take me home." The guards escorted her away, leaving Zoran standing amidst the rubble. He watched her go, shaking his head. "Some people never change," he muttered, but deep down, he wondered if this encounter would stay with her the way it would stay with him. A life saved. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint hum of rescue ships echoed in the distance. Zoran stood amidst the wreckage, his hands trembling from the effort of lifting the beam off Alina just moments ago. His lungs burned as he took in shallow breaths, his mind racing. He could have walked away, should have walked away, but something inside him wouldn't let her die. Not like that. As Zoran turned to leave, a sharp voice called out behind him. "You, stop right there." He froze. Turning slowly, he saw Alina limping toward him, supported by two guards. Her shimmering silver hair was now streaked with dust and grime, and her piercing eyes glared at him. But there was something different in her gaze, something that almost looked like confusion. "You think you can just walk away?" Alina demanded, her voice still carrying that familiar arrogance, though it was weaker now, almost uncertain. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, eyeing Zoran as though he were a threat. "I did what I had to do," Zoran said simply, his voice calm. "You're alive. That's what matters." Alina opened her mouth to respond, but her words were drowned out by a sudden roar. Zoran's head snapped toward the sound, his instincts screaming danger. From the smoke, a sleek alien craft emerged, its cannons glowing ominously. It wasn't a rescue ship, it was an attack vessel. "Get down," Zoran shouted, diving toward Alina. The guards barely had time to react before the first blast struck. The ground shook violently, throwing everyone off balance. Zoran grabbed Alina's arm and pulled her behind a collapsed structure as the guards scrambled to return fire. "What are you doing?" Alina hissed, trying to pull away. "I don't need your help." "Sure," Zoran muttered, peeking around the edge of their cover. "You're doing great on your own." The guards fired back at the attacking craft, but their weapons were no match for the ship's advanced shielding. One by one, they were taken down, leaving Zoran and Alina alone. Alina's face paled as she realized the danger they were in. "They're here for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're targeting my family." Zoran glanced at her, his mind racing. He didn't know who they were, but it didn't matter. Survival came first. He scanned the area, his engineer's mind quickly piecing together a plan. "Stay here," he said, his tone firm. "Excuse me?" Alina snapped, her pride flaring despite the situation. "You can't just order me around. Do you want to live or not?" Zoran cut her off, his eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she was stunned into silence. She nodded reluctantly. Zoran moved swiftly, his eyes scanning the wreckage. He spotted a damaged power generator nearby, its wires sparking. It wasn't much, but it might buy them some time. Using a shard of metal, he pried open the casing and began rewiring the circuits. "What are you doing?" Alina called out, her voice laced with both curiosity and frustration. "Improvising," Zoran replied, not looking up. "If this works, I can overload the generator and create an EMP. It'll disable the ship's systems for a few seconds. Enough time for us to escape. And if it doesn't work, then we won't have to worry about anything ever again." Alana's expression shifted. For the first time, she saw something in Zoran that she hadn't noticed before: determination, focus, and a calmness that even her own guards lacked. The alien craft loomed closer, its cannons charging for another blast. Zoran finished the last connection and held his breath. He jammed the wires together, and the generator sparked violently. A blinding pulse of light erupted, followed by a deafening silence. The craft's engine sputtered, its lights flickering before it began to descend uncontrollably. "Move!" Zoran shouted, grabbing Alana's hand. They sprinted through the wreckage as the craft crashed behind them, the impact sending a shockwave that knocked them both to the ground. Zoran shielded Alana with his body as debris rained down around them. When the dust finally settled, Zoran helped Alana to her feet. Her eyes searched his face, a mix of emotions flickering in her expression: shock, gratitude, and something she didn't want to admit: respect. "You saved me again," she said quietly, her voice uncharacteristically soft. Zoran shrugged, brushing dirt off his jacket. "You'd do the same for me, right?" Alana opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure what to say. The sharp-witted Heiress, always quick with a cutting remark, was at a loss. Before she could gather her thoughts, distant voices and the sound of approaching ships broke the silence. Rescue teams were finally arriving. "This is where we part ways," Zoran said, stepping back. "You'll be fine now." Alana stared at him, her pride battling with an unfamiliar feeling of guilt. "Wait," she called out as he turned to leave. Why did you help me?" Zoran paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Because someone has to be better, even if you don't think we're worth it." With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Alana standing amidst the wreckage, her heart and mind more conflicted than ever. An uneasy alliance. The night sky above the sprawling Calithian estate was alive with the glow of twin moons, their silver light casting long shadows across the gardens. Zoran stood at the edge of the estate's outer wall, his eyes scanning the towering spires and patrolling guards. This wasn't where he wanted to be. In fact, after the marketplace incident, he'd promised himself he'd stay far away from Alana and her arrogant world. But here he was. It wasn't guilt that brought him back. It was the fragment of a data chip he'd found in the wreckage of the attack. The information it contained hinted at something far worse than an isolated incident. It was a calculated move against Alana's family, orchestrated by powerful enemies. Zoran didn't care much for the Calithian elite, but innocent lives would be lost if the plot succeeded. And despite her attitude, Alana didn't deserve to die for her family's arrogance. Zoran slipped past the outer patrols, his movements precise and calculated. His years as an engineer had taught him how to navigate complex systems, whether they were circuits or people. The estate was no exception. He bypassed security nodes and deactivated sensors with ease, his tools humming softly in the quiet night. As he neared the central tower, he spotted Alana standing on a balcony, her silver hair shimmering in the moonlight. She looked different from before. Her usual arrogance seemed to have softened. She was arguing with someone, her voice sharp yet tinged with frustration. Zoran crept closer, using the shadows to mask his approach. From his vantage point, he could hear snippets of the conversation. "This is your fault." Alana hissed at a tall, imposing figure who appeared to be her father. "You ignored the warnings, and now they're targeting us." Her father's voice was cold, dismissive. "You exaggerate, Alana. A few dissidents can't harm our empire. Focus on your duties and stop wasting my time." Before Alana could respond, her father turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone, fists clenched in frustration. Zoran almost felt sorry for her. Almost. A soft rustle caught Alana's attention, and she spun around, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Zoran emerging from the shadows. "You," she hissed, stepping back. "What are you doing here? How did you even get in?" Zoran held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm not here to rob you, if that's what you're thinking." "Then why are you here?" she demanded, her voice sharp but quieter now, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. Zoran reached into his jacket and pulled out the damaged data chip. "I found this after the attack. It's encrypted, but the fragments I decoded suggest your family is in serious danger. Whoever orchestrated the explosion isn't done." Elena's expression shifted, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. She reached for the chip, but Zoran pulled it back. "Not so fast," he said. "I didn't risk coming here just to hand this over and get tossed out by your guards. I need to know you'll take this seriously." Elena glared at him, her pride clashing with the reality of the situation. "And why should I trust you? You're just a human, a nobody." Zoran smirked. "Maybe. But this nobody saved your life. Twice, if we're keeping count." Elena opened her mouth to retort but stopped herself. She hated to admit it, but he had a point. She crossed her arms, her gaze softening slightly. "Fine. What do you want?" "An alliance," Zoran said plainly. "Temporary, of course. I help you figure out who's behind this, and you make sure I don't get arrested or killed while I'm doing it." Elena hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't trust him. How could she? But the memory of his actions during the attack lingered in her mind. He'd risked his life for hers, even when he had every reason to walk away. And now he was offering to help again. "All right," she said finally, her voice low. "But if you betray me, I'll personally see to it that you regret it." Zoran chuckled. "Noted." As they worked through the night, piecing together clues from the data chip, their uneasy alliance was put to the test. Elena's sharp tongue and Zoran's dry wit clashed at every turn, but neither could deny the other's competence. The chip revealed coordinates to a hidden facility on a remote moon, one that didn't appear on any official records. "This is it," Zoran said, leaning back in his chair. "Whoever's behind the attacks is operating from here." Elena studied the holographic map, her jaw tightening. "Then we'll go there and end this." Zoran raised an eyebrow. "We? You heard me," she said, meeting his gaze. "If this conspiracy is targeting my family, I'm not sitting on the sidelines. Besides, I don't trust you to handle this on your own." Zoran smirked. "Fair enough. But don't say I didn't warn you. It's going to get dangerous." Elena's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. "I can handle danger. Can you?" As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Zoran and Elena prepared for their mission, their uneasy alliance solidifying into something neither of them could fully understand. For the first time, Elena found herself relying on someone she'd once deemed unworthy, while Zoran couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the Heiress than her arrogance. The stage was set, and the hunt for the conspirators had begun. The hidden danger. The Calithian estate was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made even the stars seem distant and muted. Inside the grand halls of the central tower, Zoran stood uncomfortably out of place. The intricate designs of the walls, glowing faintly with alien bioluminescence, were unlike anything he had ever seen. He had spent most of his life in scrapyards and crowded markets, not amidst the luxury of the Calithian elite. Zoran wasn't here to admire the decor, though. His eyes were focused on Elena, who paced back and forth in front of a holographic map. Her frustration was palpable, her usual air of arrogance replaced by a rare vulnerability. She had agreed to this uneasy alliance, but it was clear she wasn't used to working with someone like him, or being in a position where she wasn't in control. "They're 3 steps ahead of us," Elena muttered, her voice sharp. "Every move we make, they've already anticipated." "Not every move," Zoran said, leaning casually against a nearby console. "You wouldn't be alive right now if they had." Elena shot him a glare, but there was no venom behind it. Instead, there was something else, an acknowledgement she wasn't ready to voice. She turned her attention back to the map, her finger tracing the holographic projection of the remote facility they had uncovered in the data chip. "This is where the trail leads," she said, her voice steadying. "But it's heavily fortified. Even with my family's resources, It would take weeks to plan an assault. Zoran stepped closer, studying the map. "We don't need an assault," he said, his tone thoughtful. "We just need to get inside." Elena raised an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that, human? Walk in and ask nicely?" "Not exactly," Zoran replied, a sly grin creeping onto his face. "But close enough." Hours later, Zoran found himself wearing an ill-fitting uniform belonging to one of Elena's servants. The disguise felt ridiculous, but it was necessary. Elena's plan involved sending him into the facility as a worker transporting important materials. It was risky, but they had no better options. "If this doesn't work, you're dead," Elena said bluntly as she handed him a forged identification card. Zoran smirked, slipping the card into his pocket. "Good to know you've got confidence in me." Elena crossed her arms, her silver hair catching the light. "This isn't about confidence. It's about survival. If you mess up, it's not just your life on the line." Zoran's expression softened slightly. For all her sharp words, he could tell Elena was genuinely worried, though she'd never admit it. "I'll be fine," he said, his voice reassuring. "I've handled worse." Elena didn't respond, but as Zoran turned to leave, she called out to him, "Wait." He glanced back, surprised to see hesitation in her eyes. "Be careful," she said, her voice quieter. Zoran nodded. "Always." The facility was a sprawling network of interconnected buildings, guarded by heavily armed soldiers and advanced surveillance systems. Zoran kept his head down as he moved through the corridors, his hands gripping a crate of supplies. The forged ID card had worked at the entrance, but he knew one wrong move could blow his cover. As he approached a secured area marked with alien glyphs, he spotted a group of scientists discussing something in hushed tones. Their conversation was in Calithian, but Zoran's translator implant caught enough to piece together the gist. Accelerating the timeline. Target the entire royal family. Zoran's heart sank. This wasn't just about Elena. Whoever was behind this wanted to wipe out her entire bloodline. He needed to get this information back to her, but first, he needed proof. He slipped into a nearby maintenance room, using his tools to hack into the facility's mainframe. The holographic interface blinked to life, lines of alien code scrolling across the screen. Zoran's fingers moved quickly, bypassing firewalls and decrypting files. The more he uncovered, the worse it got. The conspirators weren't just targeting the Calithian Empire. They were planning a galaxy-wide coup, using advanced weapons technology stolen from the royal family. "This is bigger than I thought," Zoran muttered under his breath. Just as he finished downloading the files onto a small data drive, the door hissed open behind him. Zoran spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the stun device hidden in his pocket. A tall alien figure stood in the doorway, their silhouette outlined by the flickering lights. They weren't a guard. They were dressed in civilian clothing, but the weapon in their hand suggested otherwise. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, their voice cold and mechanical. Zoran didn't wait for an explanation. He lunged forward, catching the figure off guard and disarming them in one swift motion. The struggle was brief, but noisy. Zoran knew he didn't have much time before reinforcements arrived. He slipped out of the room and made his way back toward the exit, his heart pounding. Alarms began blaring, and guards flooded the hallways. Zoran ducked into shadows and narrow passages, using every trick he knew to stay ahead of them. Back at the Calithian estate, Elena paced nervously in the control room. She had been monitoring Zoran's progress through a hidden comm device, but the signal had gone silent minutes ago. When the door to the room finally slid open, Elena spun around, her heart skipping a beat. Zoran stumbled in, his uniform torn, and a smug grin on his face. "Missed me?" he asked, holding up the data drive. Elena rolled her eyes, but the relief in her expression was unmistakable. "You took your time. Had to make it interesting," Zoran replied, collapsing into a chair. "You're going to want to see what's on this." As the data began to play on the screen, Elena's face hardened. The scope of the conspiracy was far worse than she had imagined. For the first time, she realized that Zoran wasn't just some scrappy human. He was her best chance at stopping this. Trust tested. The silence between Elena and Zoran was heavier than the starless void outside the Calithian estate's reinforced windows. They sat in a small briefing room, the stolen data drive spinning a holographic map of the galaxy above them. Bright red points marked the planets targeted by the conspiracy. Each point felt like a dagger to Elena's pride and to her growing sense of responsibility. "This isn't just about your family," Zoran said, breaking the silence. His tone was calm, but edged with urgency. "They're planning to destabilize entire systems. If we don't act fast, billions could die." Elena stared at the map, her hands clenched into fists. "You don't have to remind me of the stakes," she snapped, though her voice faltered. "I know what's at risk." Zoran leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you? Because so far, it feels like I'm the only one actually trying to stop this." Elena's eyes flashed, and she stood abruptly. "You think I don't care? That I haven't risked anything? You're here because of me. And I'm still alive because of me." Zoran shot back, standing as well. Their faces were inches apart now, the tension crackling like static in the air. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, Elena took a step back, her expression softening. "We need to work together," she said quietly, almost as if admitting defeat. "Fighting each other won't save anyone." Zoran nodded, though his gaze didn't soften entirely. "Finally, something we agree on." Their uneasy truce was tested almost immediately. As they prepared to infiltrate the facility from the data drive, they needed resources, and that meant relying on Elena's closest allies. The problem: one of them might already be compromised. The meeting took place in a hidden chamber deep within the Calithian estate. Elena had gathered 3 of her most trusted advisors: Relok, her father's chief strategist; Kara, her lifelong friend and head of security; and Thax, a tech specialist with a reputation for brilliance and secrecy. "This human," Relok began, his voice dripping with disdain as he gestured toward Zoran, "is a liability. We don't even know his true motives." "My motives?" Zoran replied, arching an eyebrow. "I could ask the same about all of you." Elena raised a hand, silencing both men. "Enough. We don't have time for petty arguments. The facility on Andrax 4 is the key to stopping this conspiracy, and we need a plan to breach it." Kara leaned forward, her sharp features illuminated by the faint glow of the holographic map. "The facility is heavily fortified. We'll need to disable their defenses before we can even think about getting inside." "Easier said than done," Thax muttered, tapping away on a handheld device. "Their systems are some of the most advanced I've seen. It would take weeks to crack their security remotely." Zoran frowned. "Then we do it the old-fashioned way. Someone has to go in and disable it manually." Relok scoffed. "And who do you suggest for such a suicidal mission?" "Yourself." Zoran shrugged. "I've been in worse situations." Elena's voice cut through the growing tension. "No, we'll go together." The room fell silent. Relok looked horrified, Kara concerned, and Thax merely intrigued. Zoran, for his part, looked amused. "Didn't know you cared so much," Zoran quipped. Elena ignored him. "This conspiracy is targeting my family. I won't sit on the sidelines while someone else takes the risks." As the meeting ended, the group disbanded to make preparations. Zoran lingered in the chamber, studying the holographic map. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way Relok had spoken, the subtle glances between Kara and Thax, it didn't add up. "Something on your mind, human." Elena's voice broke his concentration. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Your inner circle," Zoran said, turning to face her. "Are you sure you can trust them?" Elena frowned. "I've known them my whole life." "That's not an answer," Zoran replied, his tone serious. One of them could be feeding information to the people we're trying to stop. If they know our plan before we even start. I know, Elena interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. She sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. I've thought about it, but I can't accuse them without proof. If I'm wrong, I'll alienate the only allies I have left. Zoran studied her for a moment before nodding. Then we'll get proof. That night, Zoran set a trap. Using a decoy plan uploaded to the estate's central system, he created a fake mission outline for the Andrax 4 facility. It was convincing enough to fool anyone monitoring their communications. Now, all they had to do was wait. The following morning, as Elena and Zoran prepared to leave, an encrypted transmission was intercepted by the estate's security systems. Zoran and Elena gathered in the control room as the transmission played on the monitor. It's Thax, Elena whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. The tech specialist's image flickered on the screen as he relayed the decoy plan to an unknown contact. Zoran folded his arms. Looks like we found our mole. Elena's expression hardened, her usual arrogance replaced by a cold determination. I'll handle him. No, Zoran said firmly. We'll handle him. Together. The final stand. The cold, barren landscape of Andrax 4 stretched endlessly under a blood-red sky. The air was thin, and the ground was littered with jagged rocks and patches of frost. The hidden facility loomed in the distance, a fortress of black steel surrounded by towering turrets and pulsating energy shields. It looked impenetrable, but Zoran and Elena had no choice. They were out of time. Zoran adjusted the straps on his gear, his sharp eyes scanning the facility's defenses. Every turret, every patrol, every blind spot. It all had to be perfect. This isn't going to be easy, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Elena stood beside him, her silver hair tied back, and her royal insignia replaced with a tactical suit. She looked less like an heiress, and more like a soldier. Nothing worth doing ever is, she replied, her voice steady. She had shed much of her arrogance over the past few days, though a flicker of it remained, a spark of determination that kept her going. Let's hope your family's tech is as good as you say it is, Zoran said, glancing at the device in her hand. Elena held up the small spherical gadget. This disruptor will temporarily take down their shields, but only for 5 minutes, if we're still in there when the shields come back up. We won't be, Zoran interrupted, though the doubt in his voice betrayed him. The plan was simple, at least on paper. Zoran and Elena would infiltrate the facility through an underground maintenance tunnel discovered in the intercepted schematics. Once inside, they would locate the command center, disable the weapons systems, and upload the virus Elena had prepared. The virus would shut down the entire facility, giving them a chance to escape before reinforcements arrived. But simple plans rarely stay simple. The maintenance tunnel was dark and narrow, the air damp and filled with the faint hum of machinery. Zoran led the way, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. Elena followed close behind, her every step measured. Still think this is a good idea? Elena asked, her tone lighter than the situation called for. Not really, Zoran admitted, glancing back at her with a smirk. But it's better than sitting around waiting for the galaxy to burn. Elena didn't respond, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward. As they neared the end of the tunnel, Zoran held up a hand, signaling for Elena to stop. He crouched low, peering through a grate that opened into the facility's lower levels. The area was crawling with guards, their black armor gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Great, Zoran whispered. It's a party. Elena leaned in beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the guards' movements. We'll need a distraction. Zoran nodded, pulling a small explosive device from his pack. This should get their attention. He set the timer and slid the device through the grate. Moments later, a loud bang echoed through the corridor, followed by shouts and frantic footsteps as the guards rushed toward the noise. Let's move, Zoran said, pulling the grate open. Navigating the facility was like threading a needle. Every corner held the risk of discovery, and the constant hum of alarms from the outer perimeter only added to the tension. Zoran's heart raced as they approached the command center, its reinforced doors sealed tight. "This is it," Elena said, placing the disruptor against the door's control panel. The device hummed to life, sending a pulse of energy through the circuits. The doors slid open with a hiss, revealing a massive room filled with consoles and holographic displays. Elena moved quickly, plugging the virus into the central terminal. "This will take a few minutes," she said, her fingers flying across the console's interface. Zoran nodded, his eyes on the entrance. "I'll cover you." Minutes felt like hours as the virus worked its way through the facility systems. Zoran paced near the door, his grip tight on his weapon. "We've got company," he said, spotting movement in the corridor. Elena didn't look up. "Keep them busy. I'm almost done." The first wave of guards stormed in, their weapons blazing. Zoran ducked behind a console, returning fire with precision. The room lit up with bursts of energy, the air thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burnt circuits. "Any day now," Zoran shouted, taking down another guard. "Done," Elena yelled, yanking the virus drive from the console. The lights flickered, and the hum of machinery began to fade as the facility's systems shut down. "Time to go." Zoran grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the exit. Their escape was a blur of gunfire and explosions. The facility's defenses, now offline, left the guards scrambling to contain the chaos. Zoran and Elena weaved through the chaos, their breaths ragged but determined. As they reached the outer perimeter, the shields began to flicker back to life. Zoran pushed Elena through the final barrier just as the shields sealed shut behind them. They collapsed onto the rocky ground outside, gasping for air. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of what they had just accomplished settling over them. "We did it," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Zoran replied, staring up at the red sky. "We actually did." But the victory was short-lived. In the distance, the sound of approaching ships grew louder. The conspirators wouldn't give up so easily, and both Zoran and Elena knew their fight was far from over. Redemption. The battle had ended hours ago, but the echoes of explosions and gunfire still lingered in Zoran's ears. He stood on a ridge overlooking the ruins of the Andrax 4 facility, the cold wind biting at his skin. Smoke rose in thick columns, twisting into the crimson sky like ghostly fingers. Despite the destruction, there was no sense of victory. Not yet. Beside him, Elena stared into the distance, her silver hair tousled and her armor scratched from the fight. She looked different, hardened, but not in the arrogant way she once carried herself. Her piercing gaze had softened, and for the first time, Zoran saw something entirely new in her: humility. "They're not going to stop," Elena said quietly, breaking the silence. "Even with the facility destroyed, they'll regroup. They always do." Zoran shifted his weight, the weight of exhaustion tugging at him. "Maybe. But you've got something they don't." Elena turned her head, raising an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Hope," Zoran replied simply. "And someone who knows how to improvise when things go to hell." A faint smile tugged at Elena's lips, though it was fleeting. "I suppose you think you deserve credit for all of this." Zoran smirked. "Well, I did save your life 3 times now. I'm starting to think I should start charging." Elena laughed softly, a sound Zoran had never heard from her before. It wasn't mocking or condescending. It was genuine. 3 times, huh? I suppose I should thank you." "I wouldn't mind hearing it," Zoran said, leaning casually against a nearby rock. Elena sighed, her gaze returning to the horizon. "Thank you, Zoran, for everything." Her voice was quiet but sincere, and the words carried a weight that surprised even her. Back at the Calithian estate, the mood was tense. Elena's inner circle had been shattered by the revelation of Fax's betrayal, and the surviving members of her family were still reeling from the conspiracy's near success. Elena stood at the head of the main hall, addressing the remaining advisors and loyal guards. "The conspiracy didn't end with Andrax 4, she said firmly. "This was just one battle in a much larger war. If we don't adapt, we won't survive." The room was silent, her words sinking in. Zoran stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed as he watched her. She carried herself differently now, not as a spoiled heiress, but as a leader. And for once, the people in the room weren't looking at her with fear or resentment. They were looking at her with respect. After the meeting, Elena found Zoran in the estate's courtyard, where he was inspecting the damage to his gear. "You could stay, she said, her voice softer than usual. Zoran glanced up, surprised by her tone. "Stay. I'm not exactly the palace type." Elena smirked. "No, you're not. But you're more useful than half the people here. And I could use someone who isn't afraid to challenge me." Zoran chuckled. "Careful. That almost sounded like a compliment." "Don't push your luck," Elena replied, though there was no bite in her words. She hesitated, then added, "I'm serious, though. You've proven yourself. If you stay, you'd have a real purpose, a chance to make a difference." Zoran considered her words. He had spent most of his life drifting, fixing things for people who barely noticed him. For the first time, he felt like he'd been part of something bigger, something that mattered. But staying meant stepping into a world he didn't belong to, a world of politics and power struggles. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his tone non-committal. Elena nodded, seeming to understand. "Just don't take too long. The galaxy won't wait." As the days passed, Zoran found himself lingering at the estate longer than he intended. He helped rebuild defenses, trained guards in human tactics, and even repaired damaged tech in the royal labs. Each day, he saw Elena taking on more responsibility, stepping fully into the role she had once avoided. She wasn't just leading, she was inspiring. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the estate, Zoran found Elena in the strategy room, studying a map of the galaxy. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening. "Still here?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. "Still here," Zoran replied, leaning against the doorway. "I guess I'm starting to like this place." Elena's lips curved into a small smile. "Does that mean you've made your decision?" Zoran shrugged. "I'm not sure I trust you yet." "Funny," Elena said, crossing her arms. "I was going to say the same about you." They both laughed, the sound echoing through the room. For a moment, it felt like the weight of the galaxy had lifted, replaced by something neither of them had expected: mutual respect. The story closes on Zoran and Elena standing together on the estate's highest balcony, gazing out at the stars. They knew the battles ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, they weren't facing them alone. Together, they had a chance to not just survive, but to change the galaxy for the better.